Let's hope it just stops. We'll pause. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I hope all is well with you today. My name is Tamia. I go by Silkslips here and elsewhere. If you're familiar with my videos already, you might be wondering why the title says part 1. I've finally decided to do more research and speak extensively about Ivy League, preppy style, and the corporate professional influence on clothing after being bullied into it by myself. I chose Cult of Ivy as a working title because I wanted to talk about fashionable trends and clothing styles as they pertain to and sit alongside the politics, histories, and inner machinations of a very particular kind of exclusivity and separatism cult existent in specific subcultures that place an emphasis on a combination of academic and or professional excellence, patriotism, US American and Canadian traditionalism, social elitism, and like eco-fascist teas. So the next 3 videos that don this title or a similar one will be kind of loaded with these topics and sit alongside each other, but split up as I find them to be so extensive but relevant to the now. And yeah, in many ways I don't think that one video would encapsulate everything that I have to say. Anyways, it would be a bit more fun to work backwards on the timeline with this and drop the other videos further into the future. So please do be patient with this despite the fact that it says part 1. Thank you. That being said, today's video is meant to explore what I am coining as dirtbag prep, the imagery and stylings of a very recent mode of preppiness that estranges from some aspects of traditional prep's inherent conservatism, and the immersion with irony that prep had in the early 2000s, that trope of like being a frat boy with a little dip on your chip, before the term metrosexual was created. Think six-pack abs with bleached, shaggy, cropped hair, flip-flops with jeans, popped collars on polos and rugby shirts, tan lines paired with that all during the Bush administration, and the ripple effects that this kind of look has had as a whole. Alongside that, my theories on why it was so popular and a current similar trend that has been floating around here and there for some years among people I recognize as early adopters. And I think it'll morph into something more mainstream again very soon because of the state of global politics.
And I look and I go around sometimes and I hang out with other people that are my age and they're just kind of
Relax.
I'm just like, dude, like, oh my god, like, can we talk about like the political and economic state of the world right now?
A little bit further down the line, I'll also be talking about a couple of tongue-in-cheek high fashion brands and their recent runway shows that speak to my thoughts succinctly. That being Badagan and D-Squared. Okay, let's get started. The very first time I ever saw the effects of this style in real time is viscerally burned into my memory. The year was 2005.
Just to imagine if I was down there, and those are my people down there. So anybody out there that wants to do anything that we can help with the setup, the way America is set up to help the poor, the black people, the less well off as slow as possible. I mean, this is Red Cross is doing everything they can. We already realize a lot of the people that could help are at war right now, fighting another way, and they've given them permission to go down and shoot us.
And subtle, but in even many ways more profoundly devastating, is the lasting damage to the survivors' will to rebuild and remain in the area. The destruction of the spirit of the people of southern Louisiana and Mississippi may end up being the most tragic loss of all.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Please call.
It was my very first day of 4th grade. Everyone in grades 4, 5, and 6 of my elementary school were huddled around outside in the beaming hot sun, waiting to be let inside to start the day. There were so many new faces, and I noticed that these clothes in ocean blue, salmon, khaki, etc. were showing up on a myriad of my other classmates throughout the year. So after catching a good look of the logo on my friend's shirt, who also had a bleach blonde shaggy haircut, that I mentioned was so quintessential to this style, I eventually found myself begging my mom to take me to the mall, hoping to sway her to get me the shirt or something else, to which she finally conceded the following September. I didn't know what to expect. It was an incredible surprise for me to walk into my local malls, Abercrombie and Fitch, under the impression that this was just a regular back to school shopping trip just like any other, and I'm seeing these towering 6-foot tall posters all around the store in black and white of these muscular college age shirtless white guys like wrestling on the beach. The retail floor was big from what I recall, but that didn't matter much because it was absolutely packed from the very front windows all the way to the fitting rooms, and the lineups to the cash register were like ants seeking making food. Needless to say, my mom and I were both overwhelmed about this entire experience. My mother, who grown to, become even more confused about why I even wanted to shop there, much preferred to get me something from Abercrombie's tamer, cheaper counterpart and competitor directly across the hallway, American Eagle. I was never able to get my mom to take me to an Abercrombie and Fitch ever again. Made worse by Hollister and the absolute wafting stench of musky, piney cologne and the unfriendly fratty greeters standing shirtless watchguard outside of their storefronts. I wasn't able to see the mysteries of the inside of a Hollister until I was a full-fledged mall rat in my early teens. Mall culture enabled people to develop their senses of style through observance in public settings. The mall served a social purpose of congregation as much as it served a function of consumer retail, of putting a myriad of styles in one place decked out in thorough visual merchandising strategies in stores, as well as the rather specific placement of the stores themselves. The cool clothes of the time had a very specific known locale that could be found chartered in big letters across your peers' t-shirts, overt in its cult-like messaging if you could make the trip and get past the cost. And the accompanying feeling that style was collective and very explicitly connected to one's belonging to an in-group as necessity, as social survival, was more of a present idea then and welcomed more than I would think it to be now. Maybe it exists now in different ways. I'm just not in a space to know that very well. But anyways, while we'll be getting into the oddly ominous branding and my theories about the shirtless guys playing rugby on the beach, we also have to talk about the insidiousness behind the veneer, the controversies that arose around the branding, CEO commentary, the exploitation of models, the boycotts for workers' rights, the competition between the brands, and the fabricated origins that have been created to connote a vintage feel. Starting with brand history, obviously, how they managed to get to where they ended up by the early 2010s and their impact on the now. Kind of take this as a case study. Kind of. Yeah, we'll go in order of age. So in case you didn't know, Abercrombie started as an upscale outfitting store for outdoor gear in New York City in 1892. Founded by David T. Abercrombie, it was a store that was created primarily for hunters, campers, woodcraft enthusiasts, and the colonial elite near the beginning of the Jim Crow era and the coinciding beginnings of North America's national parks, when outdoor sport and activity were gaining a huge push in industry. In 1900, Abercrombie, the store, was invested in by a wealthy frequent customer named Ezra Fitch, who happened to be a real estate developer and a lawyer. Fitch eventually bought out Abercrombie, the guy, and became the sole proprietor of the store from 1907 till 1928. For decades thereafter, Abercrombie and Fitch was recognized as peak among sporting goods stores, famously supplying Ernest Hemingway with the Beretta he used to himself in 1961. And when I say upscale, I mean they were selling custom pew-pews for an inflation-adjusted $33,000, dog sleds for an inflation-adjusted $6,600, and gold and onyx chess sets for an inflation-adjusted $99,460.22. They couldn't keep that up though, because by 1976, Abercrombie and Fitch filed for bankruptcy. In 1978, it got sold to Oshman Sporting Goods, based out of Texas, and then again, it got sold to Les Wexner's Limited Brands in 1988. This is the same Les Wexner whose business advisor was Jeffrey Epstein from 1987 until 2007. The same Les Wexner who Epstein allegedly pitched himself to as a model scout for Victoria's Secret of Limited Brands. Because it's such a sordid history, I'll try to put a timeline somewhere around at some point. Back in line with what I've been saying. Columbia Business School graduate and brand merchandiser Mike Jeffries ends up getting pulled onto Abercrombie & Fitch as the CEO and chairman in 1992. Shortly thereafter, Mike Jeffries sought to revamp A&F and acquired the photographer Bruce Faber to produce imagery for the company's advertisements, notably considering Faber's 1990 photo book, Bear Pond, that is presently viewed as having played an incredible role in inspiring Abercrombie's subsequent campaigns and the overall brand image that we've come to associate with it. By the early 90s, Bruce Faber had a career that was already quite turbulent that I think is inextricably relevant to the larger story of today's video as well, having shot Ralph Lauren and his family for Harper's Bazaar in 1973. Much of Calvin Klein's perfume, jeans, and underwear campaigns from the late 70s into the 90s, photographs for British Vogue and Per Louis in the early 80s, and as well shooting models in their underwear in publications like the now defunct Soho Newsweekly as well. He was distinctly recognized as controversial for the time, with many people both lauding and holding disdain for his work, but you can definitely see a pattern between the brands he worked for and his highly identifiable style of photography. Weber is widely recognized as one of a small few photographers alongside like Herbert's, whose body of work particularly feels inspired by classical Grecian sculptures. Drawing comparisons to Leni Riefenstahl's 1938 propaganda film Olympia, as well as Susan Sontag's review of an exhibition of Nazi art in 1974, and her respective belief that for those born after the early 1940s, legend by a lifetime's palaver, pro and con about communism, fascism is the great conversation piece of their parents' generation, which represents the exotic, the unknown. Paul Jobling makes an intriguing comparative analysis in his book Fashion Spreads, Work and Image in Fashion Photography since 1980, looking at various scholars' thoughts on the historical representations of the white male hard body and its associated notions in media with strength and dominance. Several critics have drawn historical parallels between the classical statue men of contemporary fashion photography and earlier manifestations of muscularity in terms of what has come to be commonly known as body fascism. Alden Klein, for instance, has argued that narcissism and fascism are isologous concepts in bodybuilding culture, while G. Roger Denson has called the iconography of Weber the restitution of Nazi metaphors and the perverse recharge of their power as sexual emotional fetishes. However, as Baudrillard suggests, it is naive to conclude that the evocation of fascism signals a current renewal of fascism. It is precisely because one is no longer there, because one is in something else, which is less amusing. It is for this reason that fascism can again become fascinating in its filtered cruelty, aestheticized by retro. Interesting paragraph. So,
no, I'm saying
what now?
I mean, it's not specifically for that audience.
I just think it's fascinating to hear about where the line has been drawn by aesthetics theorists of this retro masculine look that has come to be seen as integral to one of the most widely known propaganda campaigns in the world. And remembering that Bruce Weber and Mike Jeffries were both born in the USA in the mid-40s, such that I think this fits.
Oh my God, look, again.
All day.
My eyes look straight down at it.
What?
Again. And there's two.
See?
You feel me?
That's how, all
Every
day.
day.
All day.
1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3,
Five,
4,
five,
4,
five.
4, 5. Every day.
All day.
I'm looking into it. I had enough.
Especially when you consider the whiteness and tokenized othering that exists so prominently in Abercrombie's ads from the 90s and 2000s, and the fact that an important aspect of the propaganda in Germany pre-1945 heavily aspires itself to classical antiquity, to the beckoning of a previous time unknown in order to bring about this collective sense of empowerment found through appearances of white masculine strength. Down the line, you'll see that Weber's and Jeffries' combined visions for 2000s Americana and reactionary commentary for youth culture manifested into Abercrombie are connected to these ideas, not objectively, because this is just my theory, but I don't know. A big part of my framing with this is simply to better understand how we even got this like sexualized, fratty, combo, disheveled but clean look, pulling from Ivy style as a newer form of preppy, and in tandem, how this style managed to gain such popularity among people as a collective in years past. And the fact that that idea feels close to the very current, very prominent discussion in fashion spaces online that question a supposed absence of true personal style because of social media's purpose of regurgitation and replication. Not to go on too much of a tangent in relation to my earlier point about body fascism as it relates to both propaganda around and after 1945 and conformity in the early 2000s to the early 2010s. But a part of my point here is that I think people's concerns with the disappearance of personal style through social media is linked to the wave of conservative ideas and concerns barreling across these apps and gripping people's minds. In the same way that propaganda for the traditional household and the imposition of the milquetoast House, white picket fence, nuclear family can be seen on certain algorithmic platforms like TikTok and Twitter through imagery meant to be seen as aspirational. So it should be understood that there is more to what can only be seen as an assimilation to specific ways of being, or the regression to likeness, both to illustrate closeness with whom one wants to identify with and to distance oneself from whoever is presently seen as the other. The creation of in-group tunnel vision through what is and isn't included in popular imagery. I don't want to make this a video about like corporate representation or whatever, because like I don't care about that and I don't think it's ultimately that important, but we do have to understand that, like, especially post 9/11, there was a deep social need for this perception of unity and national pride and conservatism that lurked in so much media, and fashion's not excluded from that. I've talked about Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, "the medium is the message," before on this channel, but I think tacking onto that, we have to remember that content holds a message that is often understood more succinctly through the medium. Again, like TikTok, tradwife content is not just about homesteading. Reddit, red pill content downstream from 4chan is not just about like dating advice or whatever it was supposed to start as. I don't know, none of these words are in the Bible, so I digress. I hope you get my point. Clap if you don't get my point. I don't know. We'll talk about dog whistles a little bit more later. So, getting into the alleged desperate middle child, American Eagle. They held a lot of space, literally, in 2000s mall culture, but most notably, there are some controversies that have affected the company in years past, and their rise to popularity ties into my last point well, I think. American Eagle Outfitters began as a clothing retailer in 1977, founded by Mark and Jerry Silverman, brothers who'd spent much of their careers running their family business, Silverman's Menswear, in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, a small town near Pittsburgh. They'd realized that their business model was narrow for their aspirations and figured they would expand into chains for different demographics. In doing so, they could then have multiple stores operating in the same mall, and that's when they decided to add American Eagle Outfitters as a subsidiary to their grandparents' brand, Silverman's Menswear. They were Nepo babies, yes. When American Eagle Outfitters first opened their doors, it was to sell men's and women's leisure wear with more of a focus towards men, selling gear for outdoor sports and activities like climbing, camping, and hiking. Does any of this sound familiar? Maybe. If not, it's okay. You'll figure it out moving along. The Silvermans had some financial trouble in the early 80s and sold 50% of their parent company to the Schottenstein family, who eventually bought them out and expanded the Silverman family business further, creating multiple new businesses aside Silverman's Menswear. And then they dropped a vast majority of them, leaving only one store in the wake, focusing on the success of American Eagle Outfitters. This was when they shifted their sights away from gear and more towards casual clothes and accessories for women and men, shifting towards the beach bum surfer inspired Abercrombie-esque style that we know of them to have now. Honestly, after that, their history is kind of boring. But there were some highlights. They get really into jeans in 1990. J. Crew did a campaign with Dawson's Creek in 1998, which is the year that it premiered. The campaign was very similar to imagery that we're looking at today. Then, in 1999, the following year, American Eagle became the official outfitter for Dawson's Creek, providing the show's costume designer with product for the cast to wear on screen. And then, same year, 1999, American Eagle was embroiled in a lawsuit that had been launched by Abercrombie, wherein Abercrombie and Fitch claimed that American Eagle was copying them. Based on all of this, feel free to leave a comment below on whether or not you think American Eagle was copying Abercrombie and Fitch or J. Crew. I'm curious of opinions. I think the way that they really tried to set themselves apart was by doing random, like, curative, immersive branding things that, given the rest of the things that I say in this video, were not really that different from Abercrombie and Fitch or, like, other brands at the time. But the things that they chose to do were kind of interesting. American Eagle was releasing compilation mixtapes, and they had a radio on their website at one point. I remember listening to it when I was in, like, 6th grade. Sounds questionable. Sometimes it was, but I was, like, 12, and listening to, like, Elliott Smith on there, like, You'd be surprised. Back to the timeline. In 2004, National Logistics Services, American Eagle's distribution contractor based in the Greater Toronto area, was under fire for workers' rights violations, prompting a strike and a campaign titled American Vulture, launched by their labor union Unite Here against the retail corporation. So there was that boycott, and then they're also listed on a few other boycott lists for their 43-ish stores in Israel. Anyways, let's talk about Hollister. Hollister's very young. It started in 2000 under the creative oversight of Mike Jeffries at Abercrombie & Fitch. Aesthetically, it holds a lot of the same qualities that Abercrombie & Fitch does, but the way that it's marketed, its aesthetic properties feel condensed almost, for lack of a better word. Hollister feels entirely built on an idea, and that's because it is. Two major points of contention as it relates to Hollister's branding are the name and the fictional story that's been touted as the origin of the company. The story claims that a guy named John Hollister Sr., who had kids apparently, moved from New York City to the Dutch East Indies and then came back to the USA and started a company called Hollister in California, no specific city, in 1922. In reality, the company was founded in Ohio in 2000. There actually is a city called Hollister in California. In 2009, Abercrombie & Fitch was threatening legal action against the residents and businesses of the city for using the name on school t-shirts and tourist merch, having applied trademarks to the name Hollister for just about any and all garments and accessories for about 9 years by that time. So when the brand started, they took this city's name and just told them you're not allowed to use it anymore. Okay, the townspeople were pissed, obviously. Yeah, there has to be a word for that. Now's a good time to mention that the brands that I've chosen to talk about today, in my opinion, are an interesting demonstration of the change of speed that we're seeing in how trends are picked up and how exactly we've gotten to the point where things are turned into simulacra faster and faster over the course of a century. Abercrombie has this colonial era story that has cascaded into the brand that it is today. American Eagle story, is Nepo babies and then mergers and acquisitions or whatever, and then allegedly copying the stylings and advert techniques of other companies. And then Hollister is just this made up story about literally nothing. Yeah, they quite clearly were taking from the origins of these other brands and other things that came before it, acting as its precedent while feeding more into the nostalgia factor, as well as taking on a bit more culturally to legitimize its existence because it means nothing yet insist upon it. Going to Hollister in the early 2000s and 2010s was a lot. They played loud music, they had incredibly dim lights on the sales floor, there was / is a specific Hollister aroma of sorts that I remember being quite popular in grade school because the perfumes were sold on shelves in stores and you could smell them even if you just walked by the front of a Hollister and didn't even go inside. But that was obviously intentional. If they sprayed it on the sales floor, then you smell it on somebody, you are reminded of that sales floor, you're reminded of that experience. The storefronts themselves were frequently structured to obscure what was on the sales floor, so you had to go inside to find out what was there and still have a hard time seeing anything. Again, I haven't genuinely shopped at a mall in years, but what I remember of Hollister was that their storefronts looked like cabanas on the beach, and they always had an American flag strewn up somewhere. They really went the extra mile to form this fantasy ideal of a post-colonial beach shack, frat house, dorm room built from the ruins of a dive bar. I think the most well-known aspects of their immersive branding techniques would be the transference of their models conceptually plucked straight out of their ads and placed at the front of their stores as greeters. There's actually a lot of controversy that's followed Abercrombie and Hollister over the years, but if you particularly think it's weird or objectifying that they take random guys in whatever city they had locations in and had them doing Chippendale style work next to a Cinnabon for minimum wage, then maybe this is the time for me to talk a little bit more about Mike Jeffries, who he is, and the controversies of his work leading up to his indictment and the case filed against him for human trafficking models for his brands. We kind of talked about his vision for the brand a little bit, but I don't know if we all fully grasp how deliberate he was in his approach to Abercrombie's creative direction. There's this incredibly funny piece of investigative journalism by Benoit Denis Lewis written for Salon back in 2006. Denis Lewis went to the Abercrombie & Fitch headquarters to observe and gain information on the ins and outs of A&F. What he found was that a culture of conformity manifested from corporate and extended outward, with Mike Mike Jeffries as CEO, everyone at HQ wore ripped Abercrombie jeans, polos, and flip-flops as a uniform of sorts. He also noted that the succinctness of the smell, the appearance, the immersive experiences to be had in their stores and just outside of their stores was entirely intentional and meticulously curated through select model stores to be replicated at every location to a T, just as Jeffries contorts himself to dress and look the part, in line with his distinct thoughts on what idealized all-American youth look like, aspire to, and represent. Denise A. Lewis discusses some of A&F's approach to this and believes that Abercrombie & Fitch successfully resuscitated a 1990s version of the 1950s ideal, the white, masculine beefcake, during a time of political correctness and rejection of 50s orthodoxy. In discussions he'd had with Jeffries about the nature of the brand, Jeffries wasn't shy at all in describing its focus on, quote, cool, good-looking people, unquote, noting an exclusionary vision for Abercrombie's catalogs that, regardless of what you might perceive from the images, was not about any labels, while avoiding becoming, as he puts it, totally vanilla. This is, if you haven't caught along, this is like where all of those like controversial things that he said about people's weight and race, etc., that's where this shows up. Denise A. Lewis also grabs a quote from Margaret Dorer, the national sales manager for the menswear department at Union Bay, a competitor for Abercrombie & Fitch, who essentially says that Mike Jeffries is revered in this area of fashion for bringing a novel brand identity to the frequently overlooked mass appeal of the average American Joe, because everyone was so focused on hip-hop and urban brands that Jeffries' work was beginning to set an example for brands that likely actually exist as inspiration to Abercrombie, like Ralph Lauren. Okay, this article is so funny, but moreover, attitudes about identity and these like tongue-in-cheek sensibilities carry over into the media the brand projected. A&F Quarterly is my key reference here. This was Abercrombie & Fitch's Magalog, which was a magazine/catalog published between 1997 and 2003 with Bruce Faber as lead photographer. They were sold in-store and available for subscription. Slavoj Žižek actually wrote for their back-to-school issue titled Sex Ed that was released in 2003. This would have made that the last issue, if not the second last. For, whatever reason, I guess, he did that.
That's suspicious.
To save you some time. A lot of it was fake deep. Some of it was like, I guess he made a point, but why is he here? Yeah. Anyway, this little publication tried to be edgy and aimed to be illustrative of this like brash, off-color, reactionary humor that seems to be par for the course for the alternative conservative, even now. But they did this in the spirit of selling and advertising clothing for Abercrombie & Fitch. Referencing cultivation theory here, which was this idea that George Scribner had in the 70s, that when you watch a lot of TV or consume a lot of media, in this case, it socializes you in a way, and you begin to kind of take on characteristics that you see performed in front of you. I kind of think that could be applied to lifestyle branding of clothing and the allegiance people develop to brands as aspects of their identity construction, whether that's inadvertently or not. Through all of this, Mike Jeffries' aims in constructing this brand and ideal proved to ultimately be exploitative, having now been indicted on sex trafficking charges through coercion and fraud enacted against male models he'd promised modeling jobs with Abercrombie & Fitch for also money and drugs. He'd been under the scrutiny of a legal investigation by BBC for at least the last 3 years, alongside his partner Matthew Smith, with another class action civil suit filed in 2023, and names like Bruce Faber in tow under accusation of participation in these court documents. Bruce Faber notably already has almost 24 accusations laid against him, going back nearly a decade, and all of these things are very unfortunate but unsurprising, as I don't think exploitation in the fashion industry is something that gets spoken about nearly as much as it occurs. I think talking about the modeling industry deserves its own video, but it's genuinely upsetting to me how models are often treated as though they aren't people. Like, from the role of mannequin that they're meant to take on to the variance of unwavering expectation that that job inherently imposes onto the person doing it. There's this unique control under contract that models have to take on from agencies and companies making money off of their bodies, and there's a certain frailty to modeling as a job in general, as the role of the model endures similarly to the disposability taken on by other industry workers and garments alike. Also, it takes a certain kind of person to use money and work as fodder to use people that are just trying to pay their bills. And unfortunately, that exists in all industries, and fashion is one of them. How else do I put that? I think the artistically reductionist creative philosophies of the men that were arranging Abercrombie's ad art direction seem to be inextricably tied to their views of the world and, moreover, who they are as people. In Rebecca Arnold's incredible book, Fashion, Desire, and Anxiety, Image and Morality in the 20th Century, she gives a realist take on the obligation of the consumer body and the traps of marketed calls to action designed to encourage an unwavering adherence to corporate interest. Baudrillard has asserted that you are responsible for your own body and must invest in it and make it yield benefits, not in accordance with the order of enjoyment, but with the signs reflected and mediated by mass models, and in accordance with an organization chart of prestige. The body is wrapped in a narcissistic shell that produces a homogenized vision of culturally fetishized seduction. Its every part is a sign of exchange value, esteemed for its closeness to prevailing ideals, its readiness to be visually consumed and appreciated as a triumph over the lost natural body. The commercial concerns of the industry mean that it continues to be more lucrative to persuade everyone that there is a prepackaged lifestyle ideal waiting for them to fit into, a fantasy of sensuality and happiness based on the consumer's ability to conform. In an increasingly fragmented world, we cling to these stereotypes as a dream of stability, since, despite the rapidity of the fashion seasons, there's an underlying feeling that everything and nothing actually changes. Okay, by now, I think to better understand how we got this look, we must best try to understand whose interests the clothes serve and how those interests are served. Conformity might be the word of the day. We realize that American Eagle copied Abercrombie and J. Crew, and Abercrombie and Hollister copied Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren and Nazi Germany and Native Hawaiian surfers, and Nazi Germany copied Greece and the Romans copied Greece. You see what I'm saying? Like, you see where I'm going with this? This pattern of assimilation and likeness that occurred prior to one's own, conforming to things, yet somehow also drawing upon them for familiarity that one does not really have, and then repackaging them for your own interests. Again, Abercrombie was born out of a colonial era ideal, starting a store where you sell really expensive stuff for guys to be dudes, but then in the last 20 years, it embraced an aestheticized wilderness college experience for guys to just be dudes.
What's better than this? Guys being dudes.
A fantasy-focused brand for frat bros, while American Eagle is allegedly just a watered-down version of that consequently reifies the image and message that Abercrombie is also pushing. And then there's Hollister, which is a copy of a copy, completely based on an idea of itself, conjuring a history that doesn't exist. The postmodern condition is literally just that. We ran out of personality combinations that make sense. Like, this is why I think we're in a postmodern era, but that's neither here nor there. Born too late to buy a house, born too early to avoid the effects of World War III, born just in time to witness arguments between racist furries and conservative emos. Yeah, even then though, I'm rarely hard set about anything in fashion. I don't think community can unequivocally be portrayed through conformity in dress. There's little sense, obviously, in always assuming that by choosing to wear the same things as someone, you absolutely believe the same things or even like all the same things. I also don't think this to be true because a big part of the marketing and demonstrated appeal for many brands lies in their logos and their names. And I question whether you can develop legitimate community around a brand identity. That's not community, that's a cult. Or like, those are your coworkers, y'all are wearing a uniform. Anyone that wears head to toe Rick Owens on a daily basis need not apply. I love Rick, but anyways, I think under this very controlled hegemony, it makes sense that a lot of young people are having a hard time figuring out who they are, especially when it's so of the now to associate one's identity with individual consumption from few legitimized options and then group comparison to other people with the same or similar options. The current supposed non-existence of personal style, I think, is not so much a result of simply having nowhere to look or for having a lack of things to look at, but rather that we just have the options that are presented to us. And those options are mostly created by people and institutions that suck. And yeah, to keep us in line, considering the controversies mentioned, public relations is literally propaganda and it's everywhere. And it's supposed to be appealing. It's supposed to be hot. It's supposed to be unwittingly cool. Conformity and reverence for conservative traditional values, in heavy quotations, is purposefully wielded by the powers that be to prevent dissonance and collective systemic deviance. There's a qualitative study and analysis of immersive retail in comparison to epic idols I found fun called Epic Aspects of Retail Encounters, The Iliad of Hollister by Brown, McLaren, and Stevens. It was written for the Journal of Retailing at the University of Westminster in 2018, and it begins with a quote from a 19-year-old Irish girl entering a Hollister for the first time, describing her knowledge of the brand and what association she holds between it and the American dream. And there's a reason she felt that way. Not much really exists in a vacuum. As we know, the time frames of these brands being at the height of their popularity would have been in the late 90s to the early 2010s, time bracketed by conservative attitudes in the global north among the Bush administration of 2001 to 2009 and the Harper prime ministership of 2006 to 2015. This was a time when post 9/11 and admiration and respect for soldiers at war was of seemingly renewed importance in Western sensibilities concerning the minimum 19 out of 45 wars that happened globally between 2003 and 2009 alone that Western nations had a direct hand in or supported if you include Russia. 13 of those wars include the USA, and none of these wars ever took place on a Western nation's soil. It's not theirs, but anyways, just facts to keep in mind. So connect the dots with me. We've been talking about war a lot today. I'm tired of this, Grandpa. Continuing with the USA as my example here, 13 is a lot of wars for just 6 years. You need a lot of bodies for that. And aside the continued development of recruitment programs, military provisions like the post 9/11 Veterans Educational Assistance Act were created to enable young veterans who'd gone off to Iraq and Afghanistan to come back and have their educations entirely paid for or passed on to their family members. There was no conscription in the early 2000s, as consensus for it had been at an all-time low since prior to the 1980s, but I think that was made up for with a post-modernized, throwy military culture, and for a lot of people that enabled it to remain unquestioned, while for many others as individuals and groups it became like an elephant in the room in terms of media consumption. They really have tried to drive home the importance of the military and this idea that there are social and financial incentives for people, young people, to enlist and ensure that there is a military presence on campuses, alongside the long list of propaganda that exists continually to portray soldiers as beacons of discipline, order, and dedication, especially relevant to being online this past year and bearing witness to the various that are happening the world over, visible through our screens. Yet media portrayals of being in the military are ever present and often center fraternity, camaraderie, and bravery among soldiers before, then, and now. Massive military spending means a lot of structural and informational protection of that industry. Propaganda acts as soft power, and I don't think much is excluded from that, including the ways that we are permitted to and told to dress. Like, of course, this is a video about fashion, but here arises again this problem of propaganda against the human body to serve the interests of the establishment under capitalism, and the image of the muscular body replicating a proposed fantasy to persuade the public of conservative social and economic interests. The proposed idea of an unquestionable democracy that so obviously exists and protects you and serves you in its dominance and fascism. There is familiarity in this, and all of this is connected. There is hypocrisy in wanting a more traditional and harmonious world, while insisting upon an omnipresent enemy and tricking people about it to avoid questions about social policy or advancement of economic objectives, if not through force. Not to get too far off track, I think my big point here is that the shirtless guys on the beach in black and white, their image, there's a greater message here that goes beyond fun. I don't think it's far-fetched for me to say that Abercrombie and Fitch's advertising under Weber and Jeffries was mimicking the prescription of a very specific ideal that can notably also be seen as a technique that's used in propaganda, a portrait of camaraderie and eroticism alike, but that idea also happens to signal dog whistles inherently because of the people behind their creation. I also think that the Salon article by Dennis A. Lewis was a pertinent piece of the puzzle here. There's a heightened level of control that Jeffries wanted to have over Abercrombie and Fitch, and the general style direction taken in the 2000s and his widely discussed controversial beliefs seem to be tied to that. Fashion reflects politics. If we just saw the indie sleaze revival because of how reminiscent things feel economically and socially compared to the late 2000s, I don't know if anyone else has pointed this out, but I personally think things are going to veer in the direction of 2000s prep, and found irony in sportswear and military fatigues given the overwhelming conservative politics and warmongering positions we see taking ground at this time. It fits well with the UGG renaissance we've been in for some years now. It also fits well with sporty styles that we been seeing a lot of in recent years, like tennis inspired styles, cycling inspired styles, corpy attire, etc. But I think irony as a reaction to stress and a bad economy will make athleisure much less serious and less sober. I also see some influencers, conservative and otherwise, seeking out old Abercrombie and American Eagle on secondhand marketplaces like Depop and making it known to their masses of followers, which I think falls in line with that conformity aspect, if you catch my drift. Anyways, there is something inherent about these brands that suggests having this big logo on your chest includes you in the club of shirtless guys playing rugby in their underwear on the beach. I drew upon Noam Chomsky, another fave, in Media Control 2002 as he frames this idea through slogan and speaks to my overall thoughts on the combined immersive marketing and conformity as propaganda and fashion. You want to create a slogan that nobody's going to be against and everybody's going to be for. Nobody knows what it means because it doesn't mean anything. Its crucial value is that it diverts your attention from a question that does mean something. Do you support our policy? That's the one you're not allowed to talk about. Like Americanism and harmony. We're all together. Empty slogans. Let's join in. Let's make sure we don't have these bad people around to disrupt our harmony with their talk about class struggle, rights, and that sort of business. That's all very effective. It runs right up to today, and of course, it is carefully thought out. Yeah, whoever came up with the phrase fiscally conservative, socially progressive needs to be taken out back. With the custom Abercrombie pew pew. I searched, I couldn't figure out who it was, so yeah. I wanted to do a brand spotlight because despite how critical I am, I don't hate fashion. In fact, I want to accent the geopolitical tongue-in-cheek commentary of today's video with two high fashion brands to put the incoming storm of this style into perspective, as these brands have recently done shows that kind of back up what I'm talking about today. Starting with Barragan. Barragan was created by Victor Barragan in 2010 in Mexico City, initially beginning as a t-shirt label he ran in high school, and then through Tumblr and Instagram, the brand has come to garner a ton of attention for their ready-to-wear that's speculative, on the nose, and outspoken to say the least. Barragan's spring-summer show for 2024 took place at Mexico City's Felipe Angeles International Airport, which is brazen because of its recent controversies around government spending. The runway was captivating and almost psychically twists and subverts professionalism and uniform in ways I find rebellious and dramatic and genuinely interesting. In line with my thoughts today, many of their SS24 looks sport military fatigues, berets, variations of camo, patchwork nation flags akin to pins, Red Cross logos, the hammer and sickle, and a crucifix made out of syringes. A lot of it is wearable, but a lot of it is also just art and exists to tell a story of the creative director's thoughts and opinions. 032C's interview with Victor Barragan poses a perspective of the runway that amplifies its staged qualities and mimics CCTV footage recordings, demonstrating how the show innately relates to the movement of bodies and commodities over borders and the mass development of state and corporate surveillance. Obviously, I stand. I could talk about Barragan forever. And then there's D Squared, which is a brand that was founded under the creative direction of twin brothers Dean and Dan Catenacci from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. In 1983, they studied at Parsons. Then throughout the 80s, they designed for Ports International, now known as Ports 1961. Then they moved to Milan in 1991, where they worked for Gianni Versace and Diesel. By 1995, they'd begun D Squared together, and in the 2000s, they'd garnered a lot of celebrity endorsement, which helped their clothes blossom to the level of popularity that they have now. They've had their controversies. That's an aside. That's, maybe another video. It's not what this is about. But even still, I can recognize that they've never really wavered from the chic, kitschy, trashy, but undoubtedly Canadian look over the years, with silly Easter eggs sprawled throughout, like their slogan belt buckles and their graphic tees. I think more recently in their SS24 runway collection, there's a very literal connection to Dirtbag prep in the way that I talk about it throughout this video. Collection is super fascinating to look at and was a big spark for me in thinking this could be a good representation of fashion's response at large to the discourse around queerness as it faces conservatism and right-wing attitudes and policy in our current social climate and global politics. If Indie Sleaze was in part a romanticization of white trash, this 2024 version of the fratty, the collegiate look is further commentary and reflection of the hipster's more conservative contemporary within the American construct of whiteness. I think these creative directors, Victor Badagan and the Catenacci brothers, toy with and poke fun at everyday traditionalist identity markers. They widen the varying literal and figurative lenses that examine and reflect our experiences through runway shows. Unraveling and rewrapping signifiers we're all familiar with and told to understand just so, begging us to reframe our perspectives, and frankly, I really like that, actually. Lastly, Stephen M. Engel explains these consequences well in the essay Marketing Everyday Life, the postmodern commodity aesthetic of Abercrombie and Fitch, that within the everyday act of dressing, clothes, mass marketing, and performativity intersect to produce a subjective identity. Indeed, the marketing of the everyday distorts and destroys the boundary between the real and the imaginary, resulting in the consumer's performance of image. The division between reality and image fiction collapses, since the image functions as a template to construct reality. This counterintuitive dynamic leads Guy Debord to suggest image has become the final form of commodity reification. Hence, the image, not the apparel, is the commodity. If you take anything from this, I ask that you question everything. Remember that if something's free, you're the product. And like, share, comment, and subscribe. And like, that's about it. If you made it this far, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for everybody watching, and also for all of the interactions I get to have with you guys in the comments. I really enjoyed the comments on the last video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this one as much, if not more. Let me know below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bisous. Bye.
This one's for all my baby girls. I see your comments, ladies, and they make me smile. I'm lurking and I'm stalking when you least expect it. But lately, I've just been taking care of my business and getting my grind on. But I promise you, I'll be back to play and get my flirt on.